If I cannot see the thoughts, sensations, and emotions of this moment as a small part of me, as something separate from the rest of myself, then they become all of me. I fall into what in this teaching is called the state of identification. In this tutorial, we will examine this state. We will draw from the Genesis story of the fall from paradise as a symbolic representation of how, through negligence, the heart and the mind cease reflecting God and fall into identification. We will use Cranach's depiction of this scene and focus on a unique interpretation he adds to the biblical story. And we will set an aim throughout the week to observe as best as we can and resist falling into the state of identification.
Identifying is the chief obstacle to self-remembering. In order to remember oneself, it is necessary first of all not to identify. But in order to learn not to identify, man must first of all not call himself I, always and on all occasions.
Our psychology is a multiplicity. Our thoughts, sensations, and emotions shift from moment to moment. I walk through the corridor. I sit on my chair. I sip from my coffee. I text on my phone. In the natural state of man, without making any efforts, each of these impulses freely represents the whole, which is why we call them I's. Being awake doesn't mean eliminating these many I's. It means being separate from them and observant of them, so that when they manifest, they no longer represent my entirety. If I could remain observant and separate from walking through the corridor, sitting on my chair, sipping from my coffee, texting on my phone, then these I's would not contradict my aim to be. But because my natural inclination is to identify with each of these I's, attribute them to the whole of myself, then each I steals the place of real I. I give all my identity to the impulse of the moment. I fall into identification. This fall is portrayed in the story of Adam and Eve.
And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. In the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die.
God the Master creates Adam and Eve as stewards of his garden. They will help him maintain order and harmony. As keepers of the garden, Adam and Eve have free access to all of its fruits, save for one. God specifically commands them to avoid the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, on pain of death. This famous Genesis episode raises many questions, such as, what is this fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Why is it to be avoided? And why would God create it in the first place? These are all good questions, and each, like a branch, will lead us to a separate topic on the B pyramid. For this present tutorial, we will focus on what this episode has to teach us about identification. Symbolically speaking, the fall of man, the fall of Adam and Eve from paradise, is an allegorical description of the fall from real I to imaginary I, from the state of being awake into the state of being identified.
Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden?
Once God completes his creation and appoints Adam and Eve as keepers of his garden, we are introduced to a new character in the Genesis drama, the serpent. It approaches Eve and asks, Did not God tell you that you can eat of all the fruit of the garden? He told us we can eat of all the fruit, answers Eve, except from the tree in the midst of the garden. We can neither eat nor touch it, lest we die. You will not die, says the serpent. he convinces her to taste of the forbidden fruit. She tastes of the fruit and hands it to Adam, who also tastes of it, and they both break God's commandment. In Cranach's portrayal of this scene, this three-step sequence of breaking God's commandment, the serpent with the fruit, Eve with the fruit, and Adam with the fruit, are all shown simultaneously. Cranach adds a unique interpretation. The serpent, who was introduced to us as the most subtle of all the beasts, has made its head look like Eve's. It has the power of imitation or impersonation.
The commandment given by God to Adam told him to keep watch over the head of the serpent, that is, over the first inklings of the destructive thoughts by means of which the serpent tries to creep into our souls.
If I do not see the I of the moment as an I, as something separate from me, then it becomes me. This is the root of identification, and the fall from paradise, the fall from the state of being awake, is its consequence. We know from the previous tutorial that Adam represents the mind and Eve represents the heart. Now we can add that the serpent represents the body. The connection is not exact. Adam does not represent all of the mind, Eve doesn't represent all of the heart, nor does the serpent represent all of the body. But at these stages of the work, the connection is close enough to be useful. Identification, we learn from this episode, is a temptation that originates from the body, is presented to the heart, and then spreads to the mind. This means that an I that has originated in our body, more specifically the instinctive center, gets us emotional, and then once it's spread through our emotional center, it takes over our minds. These are the mechanics of identification. This also means that if we could observe the I at its origin, whilst our hearts and minds were still separate from it, we would stand a much better chance of maintaining real I and avoiding identification. In other words, if Eve could see the serpent for what it is and not think that it was herself, her own idea or suggestion, then she and Adam would not bite on the temptation and would not lose paradise.
It is especially difficult to free oneself from identifying, because a man naturally becomes more easily identified with the things that interest him most, to which he gives his time, his work, and his attention.
This also means that it is harder to stop identification after it has already spread to our hearts and minds. If we could see that first I as an I, we would, as John Cassian says, be catching the serpent's head and preventing its body from crawling into our being, which is what we will aim to do this week. We will aim to catch the head of the serpent, the first I that intrudes into our being. This requires a deep level of observation and a certain amount of serenity. In the more active moments of my day, when I am fully engaged in external activities, the best I might be able to do is observe how my heart and mind are fully swept away with identification. I can observe how fully identified I am with the activity of the moment, walking through the corridor, sitting on my chair, sipping from my coffee, texting, and so forth. In my more serene moments, when I have the luxury of concentrating on my efforts to be, I stand a better chance of anticipating identification and resisting it, watching for that I that will intrude into my efforts and catching it in its infancy. Both failure and success, failure to catch the first I or success in catching it, both are beneficial to understanding the state of identification.
When a man has an exact knowledge about the nature of thoughts, he recognizes which are about to enter and defile him.